Yes, he preached on sin. Yes, he preached on repentance. But he also preached preeminently on the glories of Christ and the beauty of the gospel and the reason why God should be worshipped in all things.
We're here today to talk about Jonathan Edwards, and we're talking with Dr. Jeremy Kimble. He's the Associate Professor of Theological Studies at Cedarville University. His research interests include ecclesiology, eschatology, biblical theology, hermeneutics and homiletics, biblical worldview, and the theology of Jonathan Edwards. Together with Nathan Finn, he is the editor of a book titled A Reader's Guide to the Major Writings of Jonathan Edwards. So, Dr. Kimble, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Clay. It's a pleasure to be with you.
For those who might not have much familiarity with Jonathan Edwards, could you briefly let us know who was Jonathan Edwards and how did you get interested in studying his life and ministry and theology?
Yeah, many scholars would say that Edwards is actually the greatest mind that America's ever produced. Though it's a bit ironic because he's basically British, but we'll take it. And he is a masterful writer, philosopher, probably best known as a pastor-theologian. He's a New England pastor in the mid-18th century in Northampton, Massachusetts for most of his ministry. Some of it spent as a missionary in Stockbridge, Massachusetts to Native Americans there. A very, very short stint as well as the president of Princeton University. That was where he, in fact, passed away pretty quickly at that point. But a pretty amazing career, many books written, many treatises written, many sermons preached. A key figure in the First Great Awakening, which we may come back to later on. So a number of things that he did in his lifetime as a minister of the Word. And for me personally, I think my interest was piqued. I think it was 2004 that I went to a Desiring God National Conference in Minneapolis. And John Piper, J.I. Packer, Mark Dever, others spoke on Edwards' life and ministry. And before that time, it was, I think, like many, I'd been exposed to the sinners in the hands of an angry God, that sermon. And I saw there was so much more to the man and his ministry that really got me intrigued and began to read and was just loving what I read and just thoroughly enjoyed his thoughts on various things, which led to further research and PhD days and went on from there.
So some writers, some pastors, some historians who had a love for Jonathan Edwards kind of instilled that in you through that Desiring God conference.
Absolutely. It was great to hear, especially I think it was great for me to hear from J.I. Packer on the Puritans in general and read his books as well on that. But to hear from him about the legacy of Edwards was a really intriguing thing and a real joy to hear.
Well, now you're returning the favor through your book and through your other work on Edwards, so we certainly appreciate you taking the time to talk about him with us. You mentioned his famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Many people, that might be their only exposure to Jonathan Edwards, and they may come away with this idea that he was very fire and brimstone. But if someone's only exposure to Edwards is Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, what might they not know about Jonathan Edwards?
Yeah, if that's your only exposure, it's an amazing message preached in Enfield, Connecticut, right at the beginnings of the First Great Awakening. It had a real effect on the audience there. But if it's the only exposure you have, I think you miss the way that his preaching could yield such love for and joy in God. The way that he brought that about, raised the affections of his people through the truth that he preached, would really be missed if you only saw that particular side of his preaching. Yes, he preached on sin. Yes, he preached on repentance. But he also preached preeminently on the glories of Christ and the beauty of the gospel and the reason why God should be worshipped in all things.
Where could someone go to get a better sense, a fuller sense of Edwards and his love for God, his love for his congregation, what sort of writings might they look to beyond his preaching, and particularly this one sermon?
Yeah, if someone was just beginning, I would still say it would be good of them to begin with some sermons. I think that they could, for example, look at sermons like Heaven is a World of Love. So there's a sermon that really, I think, juxtaposes sinners, that sermon, in a real tangible way, speaking of hell, and then the beauty and glory of heaven. Or I would recommend The Excellency of Christ is an amazing, wonderful sermon by Edwards that really depicts the beauty of Jesus and who he is as the Lion and the Lamb. Or one other set of sermons I would recommend would be Charity and Its Fruits, which is 10 or 12 sermons that he did on 1 Corinthians 13 and the idea of love. Very accessible and a good entryway into his thought and work. If you wanted to get more beyond into treatises and books, we go there as well. But I would tell someone to start with those kinds of sermons and get a flavor for what he does and how he writes.
And when someone picks up Heaven is a World of Love, for example, they're not going to think this is a sermon. They're going to say, hey, this is a book. How patient were these congregations? But it kind of exposes how much different a sermon was back then with just the length that Jonathan Edwards was preaching.
It's amazing, quite honestly, and it brings to mind, actually, every semester where I teach at Cedarville University, I have my theology students, when we get to that area of the doctrine of last things, we discuss heaven, they'll read that sermon. And I won't tell them beforehand that it's a sermon. And they'll read it for class, and we'll come to class, and we'll discuss what he wrote. And then I'll say, oh, by the way, guys, this is a sermon preached in the 1730s. And they are just blown away by the fact that it's not some little booklet, but that it's a typical, regular Sunday kind of message. Lengthy, but I would say in terms of his preaching is more Puritan in nature in that he often goes through the doctrine and then the application, and it's pretty straightforward in that kind of a way. I think it is, the length would get us, but in many ways, the way in which he did it would be very easy to follow in terms of structure. So that gives a lot of clarity to his writing and his thought.
Definitely. We'll be sure to link to those particular sermons you mentioned in the show notes so people don't have to dig for them. Just go to reasonabletheology.org/episode 18. You'll find those. So in this particular book that you were one of the editors for, and again, that's a reader's guide to the major writings of Jonathan Edwards, you actually contributed a chapter on his revival writings during the First Great Awakening. What was the First Great Awakening, and what role did Jonathan Edwards have to play in it?
It's a great question. And before I even go on, I would just say that if people want to get into the stuff of Edwards, edwards.yale.edu is a website that has access to literally all of his writings. So if people want to know and not invest a whole lot of money, they can go there for free. So just wanted to say that before I forgot. But the First Great Awakening, the main names of that era in we would say the mid-1730s to mid-1740s in particular, that's a really strong moment of the awakening. George Whitefield, John Wesley, Jonathan Edwards were the key players in the First Great Awakening. And I think it can be difficult to try to define in some ways revival. There are various definitions of that. Ken Minkema, in writing on this era, thinks of this as an intensification of spiritual experience. And if we just say that generally, we could say this is a time where there's an intensification both of the salvation of non-believers and of people, Christians, who are seeing God in fresh and new and astounding ways, and their affections are stirred to know and love God and live for Him and His purposes. And it's a very marked time in our country's history where this occurs and where you see salvations and real rigor in living for God with great excitement, great affection amongst the people in a particular geographic locale, New England in particular, in the States. So that was, in a nutshell, there's a lot more to be said about the First Great Awakening. I would recommend Tommy Kidd's book on this topic. He has a great book on the First Great Awakening. And Edwards is a key player as a preacher and as a writer. So just two quick things. As a preacher, he is the one who, again, in Enfield, Connecticut, preaches this sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, that in many ways begins this movement of repentance and turning toward Christ for salvation. But even before that, in his hometown, there were stirrings among the young people for the things of God and wanted to gather in small groups and pray and study the Bible voluntarily. So in his preaching, he was a big key player, as well as his writings, such as A Faithful Narrative or Religious Affections. There's several works that he wrote in this time period to both define what true awakening is and to defend it, because some were saying it was just emotionalism. Some he thought were being far too excessive. So he was kind of a mediating force, arguing for the awakening against those who didn't want to see it happening, but also arguing against its excesses. So through the pulpit and through his pen, he was, I think, bringing good, clear, sound theological thought to the whole process.
And you mentioned that Whitefield, Wesley, and Edwards were some of the three main figures for the Great Awakening. Did they have much interaction that we're aware of during this time?
Yeah, again, great question. Wesley does make his way to the States. There's not a lot of interaction we see between Wesley and Edwards. There is a significant amount between Whitefield and Edwards, and he does come to the States numerous times, and Edwards actually invites him to come to Northampton to preach, and just speaks so commendably of Whitefield's preaching and how much force and how much life it has. They conversed in Edwards' home. He and Sarah, his wife, definitely benefited, I think, from his thoughts on those things. So they were definitely conversation partners on this, though Whitefield and Wesley were mainly in England. There was some interaction in that sense.
And when we talk about Edwards' revival writings, what sort of titles would we be talking about if we were browsing a bookshelf? Or is there a collection of his revival writings? Are there particular titles from this period in his life?
Yeah. In his Yale edition of writings, so Yale University Press has put out now, I think, 26 volumes of Edwards' works in print, and the rest are all online again at edwards.yale.edu. But volume 4 of the Yale edition is called The Great Awakening, and it's all his revival writings. And that contains, just to name this off really quick, that contains A Faithful Narrative of the Surprising Work of God, which was written in 1737. And then The Distinguishing Marks of the Work of the Spirit of God, written in 1741. And then Some Thoughts Concerning the Revival, 1743. And then probably one of the better known ones would be Religious Affections, which is actually volume 2 of the Yale edition, because it gets a book all to itself. It's so significant and so long. And one final one, he wrote A Humble Attempt to Promote Explicit Agreement and Visible Union of God's People in Extraordinary Prayer. He loved those long Puritan titles. Yes. So 1748 was that. That was the last real work he wrote on the revival as a whole. And this one was calling for this kind of concert of prayer, this transcontinental concert of prayer to go on to sustain this reviving work amongst these countries. And that's, again, volume 4 of his Yale edition. And it's really enjoyable to read, to see contextually what's going on in that era in America. And then how is he responding to what's going on, and why is he saying negative and positive things? Well, there's things going on in his town and elsewhere that he has to respond to theologically, biblically, exegetically. He loves 1 John 4. It's one of his main texts he goes to again and again to define and describe revival as it truly is. But those are the main works he goes through there.
Sure. And just the Great Awakening, a very important time period for the history of the church, the history of our country, and of course the history of Edwards, as we've seen. So people would do well to familiarize themselves with the era itself and also with Edwards' role in it.
Absolutely, yeah.
He's certainly a first-class theologian. He left behind a lot of writings. He's impacted people's theological thought from his time period on. But Edwards, first and foremost, was a pastor. He was a preacher. What do we know? What was he like pastorally for his congregation in Northampton?
Yeah, so many would say he's not necessarily a model to be followed in today's society. It depends on how you view things, but the man studied immensely. So accounts say he was in his study up to 13 hours a day. And he was dedicating himself to the preaching of the word and writings that would help to explain what was going on. But lest we think he was neglecting pastoral duties, he was committed to meeting with his people. He was committed to catechizing families. He was committed to counseling as was needed, especially during the awakening. He was committed to meeting with those that were not converted about the gospel and evangelism in that sense. So he ministered practically. He did the typical things you think of in terms of marriages and funerals and those kinds of things. But he self-admittedly said in several places, especially the miscellanies at certain points, he felt that he just best served his church and the church at large by means of his preaching and his writings.
So he was self-consciously aware that he was contributing to the good of the church as a whole through his writings during his own lifetime.
He was. Yeah, he was aware of the fact that it was being disseminated, not to the degree that it is today, obviously, but still we know of letters to and from pastors encouraging him to write on certain things. We know that certain works were sent certain places and had effect, and they asked him to come speak on these things. So pre our internet era, there's still this idea of him being able to contribute in these ways. And I think in some ways, when we can look at this kind of pastoral life, there can be critical thoughts we may have, but we just may have to consider the fact that pastoral life may have been viewed differently in that time, as many pastors considered themselves pastor theologians and gave themselves to writing on these key issues of their day.
Yeah, and we're certainly glad that he did, because he's left behind this wealth of resources for us beyond just sermon manuscripts and things of that nature.
It's true, and not to get too far afield here, but I think there's been some resurgence of the pastor-theologian kind of office. And I think he's a model to look at, again, not a perfect model, but one to look at to say, in the church, in the trenches of church life, he thought of his people as he wrote his theology. It wasn't an abstract, ivory tower theologian. He tutored for a couple of years at Yale very early on. And beyond that, he was a pastor through and through, all the way through his career. And he always wrote with a people in mind, which I think is a healthy way to do theology.
And his impact on people that we would associate with the term pastor-theologian, men like John Piper, certainly look to Edwards as that example and as one who has influenced them in very significant ways.
It's agreed. And again, you can name names today of good, solid pastor theologians that you and I can both name off right now, such as John Piper, who have influenced us and others, many others, in profound ways. And it's because of the fact that they found some way, however it's worked out for them, to be able to think of the pastoral rigors alongside of that responsibility to write for the church at large, which I think is a tremendous blessing.
And Edwards doing it long before blogs and YouTube and massive Christian conferences.
Absolutely.
So he's a pastor, he's a theologian, and you note that he didn't neglect his pastoral duties, and yet we see in any biography or summary of Edwards' life, he was eventually fired from his church at Northampton. How did that come about, and what did Edwards do in response to that? What did he do afterwards?
Yeah, it's such an interesting episode. I've read numerous books on this, and it's just so intriguing. In fact, Mark Dever at that Desiring God conference spoke on this issue, and it's just a fascinating moment, because here we think of this this pastor theologian, this kind of just juggernaut, we all look at and say, what amazing writings. And you realize in his lifetime, he was fired from his church. So there's a lot of issues. So I'll just name a couple to get at the crux of it, I think. One, he pastored this church after his grandfather, Solomon Stoddard, who was a titan of a figure himself. And in Stoddard's day, he instituted what became known as the Halfway Covenant. It wasn't just his own church. It was a number of New England churches. The Halfway Covenant, to be brief here as well, is the idea that only baptized, believing members could have their children baptized in the church. So it's a congregational setting in that sense. And so the issue they were having in churches is that people were baptized as infants, but they were not showing forth fruit of being genuine Christians, not attending church, not doing things that were called for just Christians to do at large. But when the time came they had children, they wanted to have their children baptized because that was just that's what you did in that time in New England. And so the church had a quandary of saying, how do we baptize infants of people who are not members in good standing in our churches? And so they comprised this halfway covenant to say, okay, we'll do that, but you cannot, you're still not considered full members of the church, but we'll baptize your infants. And Stoddard went as far to say, as the Lord's Supper he viewed later in his career as what he called a converting ordinance. Meaning that, we're going to open the Lord's Supper even to unbelievers, noting this can be a pathway to conversion. Well, Edwards did not agree with that stance at all. And he was opposed to the halfway covenant all of his pastoral career. And he made that very clear, both in writing, but also practically when people asked for their infants to be baptized. So that was one issue. Another issue is often referred to as the bad book case. So this is intriguing as well, but there were young men, late teens, early 20s, who were viewing literature, and it was like midwife literature. So it had very basic sorts of diagrams for childbirth, for example. And they were viewing these things, and they were picking on the girls in the congregation and saying things that were at that time lewd and not necessary to say at all, just out of place. And it was found out about. And Edwards, as it's recounted anyway, he in a church service reads off a list of names to be seen by him after the service is done, and he doesn't mitigate between who the accused are and who the innocent are. He just reads off a list of names. And some parents did not appreciate the fact that he didn't differentiate between those who were accused of wrongdoing and those who were innocent victims in that sense. So that didn't bode well either. The last several years, just one more thing to say, in his church, there were not a number of people added to the membership. So there was a bit of a plateau there. The bad book case did not bode well practically for him as he was dealing with that issue with parents and families and kids there. And then the halfway covenant was one as well that was disputed. So all this came to a head. There was a church meeting. There was an ecclesiastical meeting of larger pastors in the area. And it led to, by a pretty large margin, his dismissal from the church. The ironic thing is that he's fired, and then he stays on for nearly a year afterwards. So he continues to preach and do what he has done because they've not found other pastors. They let him keep preaching and doing these things. And finally he moves on to Stockbridge, Massachusetts. He had a variety of opportunities, but he chose to go there to be a missionary to Native Americans who were there, and he ministered mostly through a translator to them throughout the vast majority of the rest of his life.
Do I remember right that he was instrumental in doing some translation work for that Native American tribe?
He was. Toward the end of that time there, he began to do some translation work as well. And that's where probably most of his best-known writing happens. original sin, freedom of the will. These are all happening later on during this time as well.
And after this time, he gets involved in academia, and he's heading over to Princeton. Is that right?
Yes, he does not want to go this direction. I don't have it in front of me, but he writes this lengthy letter to the trustees of Princeton saying why he was not suitable to be the president of Princeton. And this is typical of many, I think, Christian leaders in church history. We see this quite often, but he feels himself inadequate. And they disagree. So they write and say, no, sir, we want to elect you to this office. And so he goes there and serves for a very short time. In fact, his family hasn't even moved there by that time. And he is 56 years old. And he's inoculated for smallpox. And this is a early on in terms of like being inoculated for that kind of a disease, and he wants people to be assured of the goodness of doing that. So he does it, and it actually kills him in the end in not many days after.
At 56, so he died unexpectedly.
Yeah, he did, and probably, I mean, there are so many more I'm sure that he was waiting to write, but most people bemoan the fact that his work, A History of the Work of Redemption, was preached, and we have those sermons, but he was intending to put together what many would consider a magnum opus of what we would consider today biblical theology, thinking through the way the whole Bible comes together. And we just don't have, we have, again, sermons of that, but not the full scope of what he would have done.
So we've mentioned several works by Edwards, both sermons and standalone written works and compendiums of his writings. What do Christians today stand to gain from reading the works of Jonathan Edwards?
I think Dane Ortland said it well at the beginning of our book, wrote a great chapter on reading Edwards, and he simply said at the beginning, to read Jonathan Edwards is to see God. Not because Edwards looked like God, but because he looked at God steadily, accurately, insistently. I love those first two sentences because that's, I think, the heart of what Edwards did. He wanted to show that God is central to all, and then he wanted to show how everything related back to God for his glory, which is, I know, buzzwords and phrases we use all the time, but he really wrote in so much detail and description and with such verve toward that end. I think he serves the church so well. We can read that and see that and be recognizing the greatness of our God. And I think, as you said before, Clay, we have a chance to think deeply on virtually every facet of theology or doctrine. I mean, he thought deeply on so many things. I recall reading Original Sin during my doctoral studies and reading through and saying, you know, Original Sin can be covered in 10 minutes in a class, or you can do what he did and write a few hundred pages about it and really get into the depths of what this actually means. And he was amazing at that. So I think seeing God in his glory and plumbing the depths of theological inquiry.
So clearly we have much to gain from reading Jonathan Edwards, but he left behind a lot of written works. It's a bit overwhelming. Where would you recommend someone start?
Yeah, I would go back to those sermons again, and I would start there and just say that something like Heaven is a World of Love and The Excellency of Christ and Charity and Its Fruits would be good sermons to start with. Beyond that, I would say the revival writings would be really helpful to get into. So Volume 4 of the Yale edition, again, something like A Faithful Narrative would be a good entryway into his thought. Probably the most impactful one on me, so I'm biased toward this. I think everyone should read Religious Affections. The scope of what he does there, I think, is astounding because he goes through religious affections are those things that Christianity is comprised of. So he goes through what are not marks of true conversion and what are marks of true conversion, and he delineates between the two and just gives a great picture of how can I maybe as a pastor or a leader at like Vacation Bible School or something like that, how can I discern as best as I can as a human what is true, genuine conversion? And he was really, really helpful in that regard. Really helpful. Two others I would name off. We're now getting more toward, I think, the difficult end of things, but I would still commend them. There's one called The End for Which God Created the World. And it's a long treatise about his argument as to the reason why God made the world is for his glory. In a sentence there it is, but he writes a whole book about it. And John Piper did something with this years ago. I think the book was called A Passion for His Glory, I think. And he wrote an intro and then had the full text of that book in there with footnotes to explain some harder to read sentences. So that'd be a good book to look at, to have some commentary on that. And one last one I would say, difficult, but it would be The Nature of True Virtue. More philosophical, but great treatise on virtue. And I think we as Christians, we as a country, we as people in general need to think again on virtue and what this is, what it means to live ethically, godly, holy kinds of lives. So it's a great work there as well.
Are there any biographies that come to mind as a good entry point for someone who's thinking, I'd like to learn more about Jonathan Edwards and his life?
Yeah, I think one of the better ones would be George Marsden's work called Jonathan Edwards. Now, it's long, so he wrote a briefer biography as well. I think it's a short work on Jonathan Edwards by George Marsden as well. Both of those are fantastic. Really, really, really well done biographies there. Beyond that, there's Dane Ortland did a work, Edwards on the Christian Life, which is both biographical and it gets into some of the issues of how he conceived of the Christian life as a whole. So that's helpful as well. Doug Sweeney wrote a great little biography on Edwards as well. Very well done. So that's a few I would name off.
Yeah, I've gone through that short life of Jonathan Edwards by Marsden, and it is excellent. A really great overview, hitting the highlights, and gets you interested to read more. So it's a good place to start.
It does, because the longer one is a lot more history of America itself and the context it's set in. That shorter one it's a sweet spot, I think, of entry level. Get in there, I want to know about him. It's a great, great biography.
That's helpful. Thank you. Well, as we wrap up our conversation here, could you tell us, what do you feel is the lasting legacy of Edwards on Christianity in the United States?
Yeah, here I'm going to read a quote from Mark Knoll really quick and answer that question by saying this. Knoll said, this is years ago now, he said, Edwards' piety continued on in the revivalist tradition. His theology continued on in academic Calvinism, but there were no successors to his God-entranced worldview. The disappearance of Edwards' perspective in American Christian history has been a tragedy. But I would say, I'm reading this from a sermon by John Piper, who has himself, he's one of several, worked diligently to bring Edwards back into our minds, our consciousness. And I think what really captured Piper and others is this God-entranced worldview. So I think we do see the revivalist realities that still affect the way we think of evangelism and how we do church services. Certainly Calvinism is a big piece there. It's still an impact in our country. But I think the most dominant impact he's having now, thanks to several thinkers that are writing well on this, is his God-entranced worldview, meaning that in all of life, God is the center of all things. He's glorified in all things. He aims to be glorified in all things, and we recognize him as the center of the universe and nothing else. As simple as that sounds, we need to hear that again and again from a variety of angles, and he hit on that in so many precise, profound ways. I think that is a lasting legacy that may have been dropped in some ways in previous years. I think it's been taken up again in wonderful ways, and I hope to be seen in the years to come.
Excellent. Now, where can folks go to pick up a copy of the book, The Reader's Guide to the Major Writings of Jonathan Edwards?
Yeah, and just to say, if you want to get into Edwards and feel like I'm not sure where to start, it's a good book. We did 10 or 12 chapters basically on what we thought were the most important works that he wrote to get some commentary and thoughts on. So you can get it at Amazon. It is there. Also crossway.org. Crossway's publisher of this book. They carry it there as well.
And we'll be sure to link to that in the show notes again. That'll be found at reasonabletheology.org/episode 18. Our guest has been Dr. Jeremy Kimble. The book is a reader's guide to the major writings of Jonathan Edwards. Dr. Kimble, thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much.